What do you bring to the table?
My pretty self.
Do you cook or clean?
I clean. I cook sometimes, but I'm not gonna cook or clean unless you're providing for me. So.
Seriously, what do women bring in 2022 that is special?
Nothing.
Do most women have a cookbook? No. Or do most women really know how to cater to a man? No. Are most women virgins on their wedding day? No.
What do you bring to the table? This is a question you've probably heard countless times on social media, whether from dating gurus or from the manosphere. Although this is a fair and logical question to ask, it reflects a transactional view of relationships. It implies that relationships should only be pursued if the partner serves one's interest. Little is ever said of what one has to offer to the other partner. When it comes to that question, the value being offered in a relationship is usually along the lines of sex or financial support, things that are strictly speaking material and transactional, as if a wife or a girlfriend is little more than a prostitute or a housemaid, or that a husband or boyfriend is little more than an ATM. That is, relationships are framed as pure business transactions, rather than a genuine relationship based on love, let alone unconditional love. When one views relationships in such a starkly transactional light, it is no surprise that modern people are no more committed to relationships than multinational corporations are to domestic labor. When the profits come short, they pack up and leave, with little regard for the consequences or collateral damage. In many ways, such a transactional view of relationships is rational and logical, especially if one's goal is to maximize benefits and minimize, if not eliminate, costs. It is an approach that is very much rooted in risk management, not unlike the kind utilized by corporations and business consultants. Like a CEO, one rationally makes it a priority to maximize profit from a transaction, whether it be a business deal or a romantic relationship. However, if profits are expected to be mediocre, the next best thing is to minimize any costs if possible. If modern feminist and red pill sentiments are to be believed, then it could be said that modern men and women just don't have much value to offer in a relationship. Therefore, the logical thing to do would be to cut the losses as much as possible. With many millennials, the solution was to engage in hookup culture. The idea was that one could cut losses in a relationship by limiting the relationship to just purely sex. However, it became increasingly clear to many that sex was often too costly and that it was often difficult to separate sex from emotional intimacy and attachment. This was especially the case for young women. For men, the risk of being accused of sexual assault or worse could get a young man canceled or even imprisoned, especially in the Me Too era. Having witnessed the pitfalls of millennial dating, many in Generation Z have adopted an even more cynical view of relationships, that modern men and women are too costly to date, even for sex. Thus, we increasingly see more and more young men and women opt out of dating, not just simply because dating standards are too high, but because they increasingly feel hopeless about their long-term prospects in a relationship. Thus, avoiding relationships altogether becomes a rational way of cutting costs and managing risk. From that position, we then see feminists seeking out rational arguments for why men are oppressive and sexist and should be avoided. That marriage should also be avoided because it hinders a woman's career prospects, and that having children is bad for the environment. Likewise, we see young men in the red pill space seeking out arguments for why women are hypergamous cheaters who will only extract resources from a man, and that marriage will almost always end in a divorce that will financially ruin him. In either case, little regard is considered for why a relationship might fail. Instead, the focus is almost entirely on rationalizing why relationships with the opposite gender are bad, and how one can minimize one's losses by avoiding relationships. The assumption of failure precedes and precludes any discussion of what can be done to improve the situation. One might be tempted to say that one does not need a relationship to be happy, and that may be true for some. However, such a claim is little more than a coping mechanism for the majority. If people didn't need relationships to thrive, they wouldn't be wasting so much time on the internet complaining to strangers about the other gender, when there are countless other ways they can be spending their time. Despite what we may like to tell ourselves, deep down we do desire meaningful relationships and intimacy. There is a reason tales of love have permeated every culture around the world since time immemorial. Thus, it may be more fruitful instead to identify healthier approaches to relationships and to counter the toxic and shallow notions of love that are propagated by modern culture. Given the brutal cost of failed romance and abusive relationships, it may be tempting to think that love is ultimately not worth pursuing. However, it is worth noting that such unhealthy romance is not the product of love, but rather lust. Lust, or eros, as the ancient Greeks described it, is a type of love that is based on physical attraction. It is a type of love that is often associated with possessiveness and a desire to acquire the other person to fulfill one's lustful appetites. The Greeks prefer to distinguish it from other types of love. This distinction reflects a fundamental difference in not just types of love, but also an implied hierarchy of love. In the Christian tradition, eros is inferior to other types of love, such as agape. In the Christian tradition, agape represents the highest and purest form of love. It is the type of love that describes love between God and man. Specifically, it refers to the love that God had for humanity, such that he offered up his Son Christ as the ultimate sacrifice for the salvation of humanity. Agape is a sacrificial love that shifts the focus away from the desires of the self and towards the benefit of the other. Thus, according to Thomas Aquinas, love is willing the good of the other. Unlike eros, which views love as the need to possess the other as an object to consume, agape is a selfless love that does not view the other as a consumable product. It does not seek to manipulate the other to serve one's own interest. The other person is not forced to carry out all of one's wishes. However, that does not mean that one does not care about the actions of the other. If one truly loves the other, one must seek what is best for the other, to the best of one's altruistic judgment. No matter the disagreements one may have with one's partner, wanting what is best for them should be essential. That is, true love is not purely transactional, although certain aspects of a relationship can be transactional. If one agrees to handle the finances of the household, it is reasonable to expect one's spouse to handle some other duties within the household. Such reciprocity reflects the couple's mutual commitment to taking responsibility for the health of the relationship. Where things go wrong is when relationships become purely transactional, to the point that it becomes less like a loving relationship and more like a calculated business arrangement. An arrangement where one constantly views the other as an adversary to compete against. As we have already seen, such a toxically transactional and consumptive love inevitably leads to the corruption of relationships and ultimately their demise, thus leading to a seemingly endless cycle of failed relationships and perpetual disillusionment. This is a disillusionment that deprives us of the intimacy and love we humans so desperately seek and need in order to live fulfilling lives. But in order for us to acquire this level of intimacy, we must accept that the possibility of loss is an inevitable sacrifice that we must make in order to obtain a greater reward, that reward being true love. We must restrain ourselves from the temptation to hyper-rationalize ourselves into purely transactional relationships. We must be willing to make sacrifices for the good of the other with little expectation of material reward. When both partners are willing to love each other in such a manner, they will be more willing to trust each other not only with their financial resources and bodies, but also trust each other with their hearts. A relationship where man and woman are entrusted to each other's safekeeping and are willing to take risks for one another is ultimately a relationship that is much more fulfilling. A relationship where all pretenses and all facades are dropped, revealing only faith, truth, hope, and love. But in order to achieve such a fulfilling relationship, we must learn to not forsake love out of fear of getting hurt. We must learn to not sacrifice a chance of victory just to avoid a chance of defeat.